$211. That was the forged sum that chained Josephine Marlowe to the town scale, and no one there would ever believe the ragged teamster watching from the crowd was a wanted. In the freight trade, they'll tell you a ledger never lies, but a ledger only ever says what the man holding the pen wants it to say. If you're new to these fireside trails, hit that subscribe button and settle in, and tell us down in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now, let's go back to where this one truly begins. Larkspur Crossing sat where two freight roads crossed each other in the high, dry country of Colorado Territory. In the gold dust weeks of September 1879, a town built on nothing but the business of moving other men's cargo. Every wagon that came down off the eastern grade or up out of the southern flats had to cross the iron plate of the town scale before it went another mile, and every ounce that plate weighed got written down in a company ledger by a company clerk, and that ledger, more than the sheriff's badge or the preacher's Bible, was the true law of the town. The company that owned that scale, and the warehouse behind it, and most of the mortgages on most of the buildings along Main Street, was Ostrander Freight, and its founder, a silver-haired man named Elias Ostrander. Preferring to run his empire from a marble office 200 miles east and leave the dirty end of the business to men who did not mind getting their boots wet in it, Larkspur Crossing was not a large town, but it was a busy one, the kind of place that never quite slept because freight never quite stopped moving through it. A general store, a boarding house, a single church with a bell that rang more for funerals than weddings, a saloon that did steady business with teamsters passing through, and, at the center of it all, that iron scale, weighing everything from grain sacks to mining timber to the occasional crate of household goods bound for some homestead further west. Farmers from 3 counties brought their harvest through Larkspur Crossing, because there was nowhere else to bring them, no other scale, no other warehouse, no other road that connected the high country to the railhead 200 miles east. That, more than anything, was the true source of Ostrander Freight's power, not guns, not money, but the simple grinding fact that a man with a wagon load of grain and no other way to move it had no real choice but to trust whatever number the company scale gave him. Josephine Marlowe had grown up in the smell of mule sweat and axle grease, the only child of a freighter named Amos Marlowe, a broad, quiet, sun-cured man who had hauled grain and lumber and mining equipment over that eastern grade for 18 years. Josie, nobody but the company clerks ever used her full name. Josephine had ridden the wagon seat beside her father since she was 6 years old, had learned to read a manifest before she'd learned to read a hymnal, had learned the particular music a wagon makes when its axle is about to go before most grown teamsters learn to listen for it at all. Her mother had died of a fever when Josie was 9, and after that it had been just the two of them, father and daughter, freight road and firelight, for 14 years. Amos used to say that Larkspur Crossing didn't have a proper church, so they'd made their own out of the open sky and a good team of mules, and that had always been enough for both of them. It stopped being enough on a Tuesday in July, on the eastern grade, when the front axle of Amos Marlowe's lead wagon sheared clean through on a downhill curve and put 4 tons of freight and 1 good man into a ravine. The company report, filed and signed by the Ostrander freight yard agent, blamed it on an accident of wear. An old axle finally giving out under an honest load, a tragedy nobody could have prevented. A tidy, forgettable line of ink that closed the matter for the company inside a single week. Josie went looking for that axle herself, needing to see it with her own eyes before she'd believe a word of it. She had grown up around axles her whole life, had greased 1,000 of them with her own 2 hands, had listened to their particular creak and groan the way other daughters learned hymns, and she knew in her bones that a wear brake looks nothing at all like a fresh cut. Gradual line, not the clean, deliberate stroke she remembered glimpsing in the wreckage, before the company hands hauled the wagon away for scrap before she could look twice. Nobody would let her look twice. The axle was gone within the week, sold for iron, and with it went the only proof that her father's death might have been arranged rather than earned by an honest road. Grief alone might have been survivable. What came next was not. 3 weeks after they buried Amos Marlowe under a cottonwood on the hill above town, the Ostrander freight agent, a narrow, precise man named Vance Pruitt, summoned Josie to the company office and set a ledger down in front of her, open to a page with her father's name at the top of it. The entry claimed that on the very shipment that killed him, Amos Marlowe's wagon had come up $211 short on a grain contract, a shortage the company had generously not pursued while the man was alive to answer for it, but which now, with his death, fell as a debt against his estate. 1 worn-out saddle and 1 unmarried daughter with no income of her own, territorial freight bond law, allowed the company to convert an unpaid debt into a labor bond against the debtor's next of kin. Pruitt read it out the way a man reads a weather report off a wall, flat and unbothered, as if he were describing the sale of a human being to settle a debt her father had never actually owed. The shortage was a lie. Josie shot back. Her father had never come up short a pound of anybody's freight in 18 years, and somebody had cooked those numbers after the wreck to cover whatever had truly gone missing from that wagon. Likely the very grain that had lined somebody else's pocket, while the company pinned the loss on a dead man who could no longer argue his own case. Pruitt only tapped the ledger with 1 gloved finger. The company's books were the company's books, he said, flat and final, and the auction would be held at the town scale in 1 week's time. She'd do well to be there, since absence would only add a resistance penalty to the sum owed. Word of it moved through Larkspur Crossing the way bad news always does, fast and quiet, and by the day of the auction, half the town had turned out along Main Street to watch. Some out of sympathy they were too frightened to voice aloud. Most out of the same hungry curiosity that draws a crowd to any public spectacle where somebody else's ruin is on display. Company had chosen its stage carefully. The town scale stood at the center of everything, a heavy iron platform on a stone foundation with a tall weighing arm rising above it, the very machine that had measured out her father's whole working life in freight tonnage. And it was to that arm that a company hand looped a length of chain and locked one end around Josephine Marlowe's wrists, while Pruitt stood beside her reading the forged figure aloud to the gathered crowd like a man calling a church tithe. She did not scream, and she did not cry, not where they could see it. She stood very straight against that iron arm with her chin up and her wrists chained together in front of her, and something in that stillness unsettled the crowd more than tears would have, though nobody could have explained exactly why. The men who ran that auction for Ostrander freight were not subtle about what they were, and Pruitt had brought the muscle to prove it. Beside him stood a broad, thick-necked hired teamster named Gully Boone, a man who had been let go from 3 other outfits for the particular pleasure he took in a fistfight nobody else wanted, and who had found in Ostrander freight the one employer willing to overlook that appetite in exchange for cheap, reliable menace. Boone liked an audience. He liked the way a crowd went quiet when he cracked his knuckles, liked being the reason grown men looked at their boots instead of at him, and he had made himself comfortable at the edge of that scale platform, with his thumbs hooked in his belt. A few paces off, half hidden in the shade of the scale house awning, stood the third piece of the arrangement. The town's own constable, a soft, sweating man named Sig Talmadge, who had once been elected to keep order in Larkspur Crossing, and had long since sold that order to whoever kept his household in whiskey and his mortgage paid. Talmadge's vice was not cruelty like Boone's or cold calculation like Pruitt's. It was simple cowardice, dressed up in a badge, a man who had learned that the safest place to stand in any conflict was wherever Ostrander freight pointed him to stand, and who intended to keep standing there for as long as the company kept paying him to look the other way. Josephine Marlowe was not the first name Pruitt's careful pen had cost dearly, only the first the town had watched him collect on so openly. There had been an old rancher 2 seasons back, a widower named Cobble, whose herd count came up short against a company loan he swore he'd never taken, and who had signed away half his grazing land rather than fight a ledger he had no way of disputing. There had been a young couple, newly married, whose freight bill for lumber to build their first house had somehow doubled between the mill and the delivery, and who had spent their first winter in a half-finished cabin paying it off. Nobody had connected those quiet, separate ruins into a pattern before, because Ostrander Freight was careful to space its cruelty out to let a town forget one victim before it made another. Chaining a grieving young woman to the scale in broad daylight, in front of half the county, was the first mistake Vance Pruitt had made in years. The first time the company's methods had been dragged out where everyone could see them at once. It was Talmadge who was meant to open the bidding once Pruitt finished reading the figure, and the crowd had gone quiet and ugly curious, waiting to hear what a young woman's labor might fetch against a debt her father had never truly owed. And it was into that particular silence that a stranger stepped off the boardwalk at the edge of the square, unhurried, a lean, weathered man in a plain teamster's coat, with dust 2 states old worked into the seams of it, who had been standing at the back of the crowd for most of the morning doing nothing more remarkable than watching. Nobody in Larkspur Crossing knew his name. He had drifted into town not quite 3 weeks earlier, looking for day work at the freight yard, had kept to himself in the boarding house, had done an honest job loading and driving for whoever would pay him, and had otherwise made no impression on anybody at all, which was, as it happened, exactly the impression he had been trying to make. His name was Jonah Reed, and he was 41 years old, and there was a wanted circular with his likeness on it, folded into the lining of his boot, 3 years out of date, and still in certain territories worth $400 to whoever brought him in alive. He had not come to Larkspur Crossing looking for trouble. He had come looking for the kind of forgettable, honest day labor that let a wanted man stay fed and stay moving without ever having to lift a gun or raise his voice, and for 3 weeks that was precisely what he had found. He had noticed the Ostrander freight operation the way he noticed everything. Now, out of an old, careful habit he had never quite managed to put down, the too tight bookkeeping, the way the scale readings never seemed to favor the small shippers, the particular flavor of fear that moved through the yard hands whenever Pruitt's name came up. He had convinced himself it was none of his business. He had held to that conviction for 18 days, right up until the morning they chained a grieving young woman to that scale and started reading numbers over her like a butcher weighing a hog. Something in him that had been quiet a long time woke up standing in that crowd, and it did not ask his permission before it moved his feet. He walked through the parting crowd without hurrying, and the first person to notice him was not Pruitt or Boone, but Josie herself, who lifted her chin at the sound of boots on the packed dirt and found herself looking into a pair of pale, steady eyes that held nothing of the pity or the hunger she had seen in every other face in that square all morning. Only a kind of quiet, weighing attention. The look of a man doing careful arithmetic on a problem he had already decided how to solve. He stopped an arm's length from the scale platform, close enough that Pruitt had to break off mid-sentence and look up from his ledger, and into the silence that followed, Jonah Reed gave the crowd 4 words it would repeat for years afterward. "Take the chain off her." Gully Boone laughed first, a short, ugly bark of a sound, because a plain-dressed teamster giving orders to a company agent in the middle of a legal auction struck him as the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Pruitt did not laugh. Pruitt was a careful man, and careful men do not laugh at things they have not yet finished measuring, and something about the stillness of this stranger, the economy of him, the way he stood like a man who had learned a long time ago that most fights are won before the first blow lands, made Pruitt's careful mind reach for caution. In the flat, precise voice he used for company business, he wanted to know whether the stranger had $211 to settle the debt himself, because that, and only that, was the sort of interference the law allowed at a lawful auction. Jonah Reed did not have $211. He had $11 and change, a good horse, a good gun, and 18 days of watching this town's books closely enough to know exactly how rotten they were. What he had instead of money was a question, put quietly, almost gently, the kind of question a man raises when he already knows the answer and wants everybody else to catch up to it in front of witnesses. Where, he wanted to know, was the original shortage report, not the ledger entry made 3 weeks after the wreck, but the manifest signed and dated the day the wagon left the depot, the one that would show whether that grain had ever truly been loaded at all, or whether the $211 had simply never existed anywhere except in Vance Pruitt's careful, patient handwriting. Pruitt's mouth thinned and his hand drifted, with the particular carelessness of a man who wants a movement to look accidental toward the pistol at his hip, and it was in that half-second, with the whole square holding its breath, that something shifted in Jonah Reed that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with old, well-worn instinct. He did not draw. He did not need to. He simply let his coat fall open enough that the worn leather of a gun belt showed itself, worn low and easy in a way that no honest day laborer's belt is ever worn, and something about that particular economy of motion made Gully Boone's grin falter, and made Sig Talmadge take one small, involuntary step backward into the shade of the scale house, as though the awning itself might protect him from whatever was standing in the square. It was an old freighter at the edge of the crowd, a man who had hauled a southern route for 30 years and had seen a great many things come and go along it, whose voice, hoarse with sudden recognition, finally put the name out loud into the open air. Reed. The same Reed who had ridden with the territorial marshals 5 years back and broken apart the Whitfield smuggling line, the outfit that had used legitimate freight, manifests to move rustled cattle, and stolen ore clean across 3 counties before anybody in authority. It. By the old freighter's account, Reed had vanished from the territory the same season. The Whitfield operation collapsed, and a bounty had sat on his head ever since, posted, rumor had it, by the very man who had lost the most money the day that operation came apart. Whether Josephine Marlowe knew the name Whitfield or not, she understood well enough, watching the color drain out of Vance Pruitt's face, that the stranger who had just stepped between her and a forged debt was no idle drifter. That reversal. A wanted gunslinger buried inside a hired teamster's coat, standing quiet as a held breath in the middle of a town too small to notice him until the exact moment he chose to be noticed. Stay with us, because before this is finished, that chain is going to come off, that ledger is going to be open for the whole territory to see, and Josephine Marlowe is going to learn that the quietest man in any freight yard is very often the one worth watching. If you're enjoying this one, go ahead and smash that subscribe button before we go any further, and drop a comment telling us which of our stories you've liked best, because we read every one of them. Now, let's go back 3 weeks to the morning Jonah Reed first walked into the Ostrander freight yard looking for honest work, and follow this whole ugly business from where it truly began. Jonah Reed had learned, over 5 years, of moving quietly through territories where his face was worth money to the wrong sort of men, that the safest place in the world to hide was inside plain, hard labor. Nobody looks twice at a teamster loading grain sacks at sunup. Nobody wonders about the scars on a hired man's knuckles when there's freight to move and a foreman shouting deadlines. He had drifted into Larkspur Crossing on a gray morning in late August, with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and the particular tiredness of a man who has been running in one shape or another for longer than he cared to count, and he had inquired at the Ostrander freight yard, and they had put him to work within the hour, without inquiring after his name twice. He noticed things he wished he hadn't, almost immediately. He noticed that the scale readings on independent shippers' wagons ran consistently, suspiciously heavy, shaving a little profit off every small farmer and rancher who had no choice but to use the only scale in 3 counties. He noticed that the yard hands flinched when Pruitt's shadow crossed the doorway, the particular flinch of men who have learned that questions cost more than silence. He noticed most of all the name Ostrander stenciled on every wagon and every ledger, and felt an old unease stir in him that he could not at first entirely place, a familiarity he did not want to examine too closely. It had cost him 5 years of his life and every safe place he'd ever thought he had. He kept his head down anyway, because 5 years of running teaches a man patience he never wanted to learn, and he reminded himself, the way he had reminded himself in a dozen towns before this one, that it was not his fight, that he had already paid whatever debt he owed the world for the Whitfield business, that a man wanted on a stale bounty had no business drawing fresh attention to himself over another company's crooked scale. He held to that resolution for 18 days. He might have held to it longer, might have simply moved on to the next town the way he had moved on from a dozen towns before, if he had not, on the 19th day, watched a young woman he had exchanged perhaps 4 words with across a loading dock. Everyone who touched it, Josie herself, had spent those same 3 weeks in a fog of grief and disbelief that had only begun, in the days just before the auction, to burn away into something harder. She had gone, alone, to the territorial land office 2 towns over to ask whether a debt could truly be converted into a labor bond against a grown daughter with no signature of her own on any contract, and the clerk there, a tired, not unkind man, laid it out for her plainly, the law, as written, though he had personally never seen it invoked outside of a handful of mining camp cases nobody liked to talk about. She had gone to the town's one lawyer, who had taken one look at the Ostrander freight letterhead on Pruitt's demand, and found, with a great show of regret, that he was suddenly too busy to take her case. She had gone finally to Sig Talmadge, wearing his badge and his sweat-stained collar, and pressed him, as the town's sworn peace officer, to at least look into whether her father's shortage was real before the company was allowed to sell her labor to settle it, and not to argue with a company's books, and that she would do herself a favor by not making trouble for people with more money than sense to spend on lawyers. By the morning of the auction, Josie Marlowe had run out of doors to knock on, and had walked to the town scale with her chin up, not because she had any plan at all, but because she had decided, somewhere in those 3 grinding weeks, they were at least going to have to do it in front of witnesses, with her looking them in the eye the whole while. She had not expected a stranger's boots on the packed dirt, or 4 quiet words that would turn the whole square inside out. In the hour after Jonah Reed's name settled back into the open air of Larkspur Crossing, the town did what small towns always do, with a sudden dangerous fact. It scattered into corners to whisper about it. Pruitt did not attempt to press the auction any further that day. A man with a legitimate bounty circular somewhere on his person, and a documented history of dismantling exactly the kind of fraud Ostrander Freight was currently practicing, was not a complication Pruitt wanted to handle in front of half the town's population. In a voice gone thin and careful, that the auction would resume once certain matters had been properly clarified. Talmadge unlocked the chain himself, hands shaking slightly. Jonah did not leave town that afternoon, though every old habit in him screamed that he should have. He reasoned it was only sensible to see the girl safely off that scale platform, and back to whatever shelter she had left, and that was true as far as it went, but it was not the whole truth, and he knew it even as he walked beside her, saying little, back toward the small house at the edge of town that had been Amos Marlowe's. Josie, for her part, did not know quite what to make of the man walking beside her, grateful, plainly, in the raw, exhausted way of someone who has just been pulled back from a very particular kind of drowning, but also wary. And she had no idea yet what this stranger's price might turn out to be. He did not ask for anything. That, more than the 4 words at the scale, was what began to loosen something in her that had been clenched tight since her father's funeral. He split her firewood without her having to ask, the second evening, and ate the plain supper she set in front of him without complaint, and when she finally worked up the nerve to press him straight out whether the old freighter's story was true, and he did not embellish it either. In short, plain sentences, he laid it out. He had ridden as a hired investigator for the Territorial Marshal's office for the better part of 2 years. The Whitfield Freight Company had been running rustled cattle and stolen ore under legitimate manifests across 3 counties. Droputation, and a brother killed in the raid that ended it, had never forgiven the investigator who unraveled it, and had put a bounty on him that had followed him through 4 territories since. Josie wanted the name of that man, though some cold, careful part of her had already begun to suspect the answer before she finished the question. Elias Ostrander, by Jonah's account, had been Whitfield's silent partner the whole while, the money behind the operation never once appearing on a single manifest or ledger page, clean as new snow in every official record, and when the Whitfield line collapsed under Jonah's evidence, wearing his own name this time, and rebuilt his fortune 200 miles east, on the very freight roads Jonah had spent 2 years trying to clean up. The Ford shortage against Amos Marlowe's estate, the rig scale readings, the way Pruitt ran that yard like a man who had never once in his career worried about being caught, none of it plainly surprised Jonah in the slightest, because it was the same rot he had cut out of the Whitfield operation 5 years back. Grown back in a new company, with a cleaner name, and no one left alive who remembered its old one. Something in Josie went very still and very cold, hearing that her father had not died on a worn-out axle. He had died because he had, in all likelihood, noticed something in that grain shipment he shouldn't have. Some discrepancy that mattered enough to somebody that a wrecked wagon had been easier to arrange than an honest explanation, and the $211 shortage. It was a cover story, written after the fact by the same careful hand that had likely arranged the accident in the first place, to explain away money that had never been missing at all, only stolen, quietly, by the company itself, and blamed on a dead man who could no longer argue. She did not cry that evening, though she wanted to. She pressed Jonah instead, in a voice gone flat and hard in a way that startled even her, whether he intended to finish what he'd started 5 years ago, or whether he meant to ride on and leave Larkspur Crossing to whatever Ostrander decided to do with it next. If this story's got you hooked, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It helps keep these frontier tales riding. Jonah did not answer her question that first evening, because the honest answer frightened him more than the bounty on his head ever had. He had spent 5 years running from the consequences of the last time he'd stood up and made himself visible, and every mile of that running had cost him something. A wife once, in a town 2 territories back, who had not been able to live with the waiting and the watching that came with loving a wanted man. That standing too close to Jonah Reed made a man a target for bounty hunters who did not much care whether their information was accurate before they came shooting. He had told himself more times than he could count that the safest thing he could do for anybody who mattered to him was to keep moving, keep his distance, keep his name folded up small in the lining of his boot, but Larkspur Crossing was not letting him stay small. Word of the scale platform confrontation had traveled the freight roads faster than any of them expected, and within 3 days a rider came in from the east carrying a letter from Elias Ostrander himself, addressed not to Pruitt, but to the whole company operation. Unmistakable language that the man calling himself a drifter in Larkspur Crossing was in fact Jonah Reed, wanted in 4 territories, and that any hand who brought him in, dead being explicitly preferable to alive, would be paid a bonus on top of the standing bounty that would set a working teamster up for the rest of his natural life. Gully Boone read that letter with the particular hunger of a man who has just been handed permission to do the thing he wanted to do anyway, and let anyone in the yard who would listen know he intended to collect on it personally. Jonah heard about the letter the same evening it arrived, from a yard hand who owed him a favor and did not much care for Ostrander Freight's methods himself, and he understood, standing in Josie's small kitchen with that news settling over him like a fresh weight on old shoulders. A wanted man with a price on his head and a company letter naming him outright could not simply saddle up and vanish quietly into the next territory, not without leaving Josephine Marlowe alone in a town that had just watched her humiliated and would now, in all likelihood, watch her punished twice over for the crime of having been rescued by the wrong man. And underneath that plain, practical calculation sat a truth Jonah was slower to admit, even to himself, that in 3 weeks of splitting her firewood and eating her plain suppers, more than he had let himself care about anybody in 5 careful years, whether Josephine Marlowe survived what was coming. The next morning, over coffee gone lukewarm in the pot, he laid it out plainly. He was not going to run this time. He intended to finish the business he'd started with the Whitfield line 5 years ago, all the way through to Ostrander himself, if that's what it took. Staying meant Larkspur Crossing would take whatever the company decided to send at them, that his presence in her house was likely to bring exactly the kind of trouble no grieving young woman ought to have to face on top of everything else she'd already survived. He gave her the choice to send him away, to take her chances with the auction and the company's mercy, rather than with a wanted man's protection. Josie set her coffee cup down very carefully, the way her father had taught her to set down anything she meant to be certain of. Ostrander freight, she reminded him, had already decided, weeks ago, without asking her a single question, to chain her to a scale and sell her like livestock over a debt that never existed. What she wanted was to learn to shoot properly, not the half-hearted lessons her father had given her as a girl, but real, working competence. Because whatever was coming to Larkspur Crossing, she did not intend to stand behind anybody. Something in Jonah, some old, careful, closed-off part of him, cracked open a little further at that, hearing a grieving young woman answer terror with that particular flavor of steel. Quietly, he let her know that her father would have been proud to hear her say it, and she had to turn away from him for a moment before she trusted her voice enough to answer. The days that followed took on the strange, taut rhythm of people preparing for a storm they could see building on the horizon, but could not yet name the exact hour of its arrival. Jonah taught Josie to handle a pistol properly in the mornings before the freight yard opened, patient, unhurried instruction that had nothing of showmanship in it, and everything of a man passing along hard-won survival to someone he had decided was worth keeping alive. He walked the perimeter of her father's small property in the evenings, noting sight lines and cover the way a soldier notes ground before a battle, and began, quietly, without telling her the full extent of it, to rig the old barn and the approach road with a kind of unglamorous, practical defenses that had kept him breathing through worse fights than this. One tripwires strung to a rack of cowbells that would give warning long before any rider reached the house. Stack of oil-soaked hay bales positioned to create a wall of smoke and confusion. The wagon itself angled to funnel any approach down a single narrow lane where numbers would matter less than nerve. Word of what had happened at the scale platform, and of who Jonah Reed truly was, had by now traveled well past Larkspur Crossing's borders, and it brought, alongside Ostrander's fury, a handful of unexpected allies. The old freighter, who had first spoken Jonah's name aloud in the square, turned out to have a long memory and an old grudge of his own against Ostrander Freight's rigged scale, and he began quietly steering other independent haulers toward Josie's side of the dispute. Men who had likewise been shorted and cheated for years and had simply never had the proof or the courage to say so out loud. Even Sig Talmadge, sweating through his collar in the days after the auction, seemed to be wrestling with something that looked, for the first time in a long while, like conscience, though he was not yet brave enough to let it change his behavior in any way that might cost him his comfortable arrangement with the company. Vance Pruitt, for his part, spent those same days doing precisely what a careful man does when his careful arrangements begin coming apart at the seams. He tightened his grip rather than loosened it, doubling the number of hired teamsters on the company payroll, sending riders out to the surrounding ranches to remind independent shippers exactly whose scale they still depended on, and composing, in his narrow, precise hand, increasingly urgent letters east to Elias Ostrander, assuring him that the Reed situation would be handled quietly and permanently before it could metastasize into anything the company's investors might read about in a territorial newspaper. It was Gully Boone, characteristically impatient with careful plans, who forced the timeline. 12 days after the scale platform confrontation, on a moonless night with a wind coming down hard off the eastern grade, Boone led 11 armed company riders out toward the Marlowe property, with orders from Pruitt to burn the barn, frighten the girl into leaving town for good, collect the bounty on Jonah Reed's head before sunup. Friends, before we ride into what happened that night, if this story is keeping you good company, go ahead and hit like and drop a word in the comments. It truly helps these tales find their way to more folks who'd enjoy them. The tripwire caught the lead rider's horse a full quarter-mile out from the house, and the sudden clatter of cowbells in that black, windy silence did more to break the raid's nerve in its first 30 seconds than any gunfire could have managed. Jonah had counted on exactly that. Men riding at night to burn a poor freighter's barn expect an easy one-sided business, a frightened woman, and perhaps one reluctant hired man standing between them and a bonus payment. They do not expect the darkness itself to start ringing with warning, and they do not expect moments later, calm and unhurried, that the house ahead was neither undefended nor unaware, and that the first man to strike a match toward that barn would be the first man carried home across his own saddle. Boone, to his credit or his ruin, did not scare easily, and he pressed his riders forward past the tripwire line with curses and threats, driving them toward the barn at a gallop. What met them there was not the empty structure they expected, but the wall of oil-soaked smoke Jonah had prepared, thick and choking and disorienting in the dark, turning 11 mounted men into 11 blind coughing targets stumbling half off their horses in a haze that stung eyes and scattered formation within seconds. Jonah fired exactly twice in that first exchange, both shots deliberate, both aimed low and wide of any rider's body, taking a hat off one man's head and putting a bullet through a second man's stirrup leather close enough to unseat him without breaking a bone. The same careful economy of violence that had kept his conscience whole through 5 hard years on the run. It was Josie, positioned exactly where Jonah had drilled her to stand, in the shadow of the angled wagon, with a clear line down the funneled approach road, who put a bullet through the water trough not 3 feet from where Gully Boone had dismounted, close enough that the spray of it soaked his boots and made unmistakably clear, should he take one more step toward that house, would not be aimed at wood or water. Boone froze. Something in the particular unshaking steadiness of a young woman he had watched be chained and humiliated 2 weeks before, now standing calm and armed and utterly unafraid of him, unsettled Boone far more deeply than the smoke or the tripwires had, and in the confusion of choking riders and spooked horses, and a defense that had clearly been prepared by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, the raid broke apart within minutes rather than the hour Pruitt had allotted it. They rode back to town, having burned nothing, having captured no one, having accomplished exactly nothing except confirming in the worst possible way that Jonah Reed's reputation had not been exaggerated. One horse had gone lame in the smoke and confusion, and Gully Boone, for all his bluster, had discovered a limit to his own courage that night that he would carry quietly. Dawn came up gray and smoke-smelling over the Marlowe property, and Josie walked the yard in the thin early light checking the tripwires, resetting the cowbells, gathering up a dropped hat and a torn scrap of company coat that had caught on the fence rail during the retreat. Jonah stood at the barn door a long while watching the road east, the one Boone's riders had fled down, and said nothing for the better part of an hour, not out of grimness, but the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic on how much time they likely had left before the company tried something worse. By mid-morning, word of the failed raid had already reached town on the tongues of the 2 wounded riders, carried into the boarding house and the saloon and the general store, and Larkspur Crossing, which had spent 2 weeks whispering about the stranger at the scale. began instead to whisper about the company that had sent 11 armed men against one small freighter's house in the dead of night and come home beaten by cowbells and smoke. Pruitt received the news of the failed raid with the particular controlled fury of a careful man watching his careful plans collapse in real time, and he understood, standing in the company office at first light with Boone's battered, humiliated rider slumped outside, that quiet violence had failed him, and that whatever came next would have to be decisive, public, and final, because a second failure would not just cost the company its bounty, it would cost it its authority over every independent shipper and frightened town official who had, until now. He sent word east to Ostrander that same morning requesting for the first time in his career with the company that Ostrander himself come west to oversee the matter personally, because what had begun as a routine debt collection had become, in the space of 2 weeks, a genuine threat to everything the company had spent 5 years quietly rebuilding. It took Elias Ostrander 11 days to travel from his marble office to Larkspur Crossing, 11 days in which the town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would finally break. Josie spent those days finishing what Jonah had started, not merely learning to shoot, though her aim had grown steady and true under his patient instruction, but learning, with the old freighter's help and a handful of other independent haulers who had finally found the nerve to speak, to build a case. She went this time with 3 other shippers willing to sign their names beside hers, back to the land office, 2 towns over, and this time the clerk who had once shrugged at her sympathetically found himself looking at a pattern of complaints too consistent to dismiss, shorted weights, forged shortages, had registered in Ostrander Freight's disfavor. Jonah, for his part, spent those 11 days doing the thing he had spent 5 years avoiding, writing everything down. He had kept folded inside an oilskin pouch that had traveled every mile of his running with him the original evidence from the Whitfield investigation, ledgers and testimony, and a signed marshal's report that had never quite made it into a courtroom because the man they'd been building the case against had vanished east and rebuilt himself under a newer company name before the paperwork could catch him. He folded into it now the fresh evidence of Larkspur Crossing's rigged scale, the pattern of forged shortages, the failed raid itself, sworn to in writing by 2 of the wounded riders who, faced with the prospect of hanging for a raid they had not been the ones to order. When Elias Ostrander finally arrived in Larkspur Crossing on a clear morning, in early October, riding in a private carriage with 2 hired guns of considerably more polish and considerably less caution than Gully Boone, he came expecting to find a stubborn drifter and a foolish girl. What he found instead was a town that had, in his absence, quietly assembled itself into a witness. Ostrander's arrival forced the confrontation Pruitt had spent 2 weeks trying to arrange on the company's terms, and it happened, fittingly, at the town scale itself, where this whole business had begun. Ostrander demanded in the cold, entitled voice of the man who had never once in his life expected to hear the word no, that the girl's bond be honored, that the wanted man be surrendered to collect the bounty owed, and that the town return without further theater. It was Josie who met him, standing this time not chained to that scale's iron arm but beside it, with the land office clerk's letter in one hand and 3 other shippers' signatures behind her, and she laid it out for Elias Ostrander in a voice that did not shake. The debt he was demanding payment on had never existed. That the axle which killed her father had been cut, not worn, that the scale behind her had been rigged for 3 straight years to cheat every honest hauler who crossed it, and that the whole territory was about to learn precisely how. It was Jonah who finished it. He stepped forward with the oilskin pouch in hand, and laid it out for Ostrander plainly. The marshal's report on the Whitfield line had never been closed, only misplaced under a change of company letterhead, and that the evidence gathered in the past 2 weeks, the forged ledger, the confessions of 2 wounded riders, the pattern of rigged weights sworn to by 4 independent shippers, would be riding east with a territorial marshal who had, as it happened, been quietly summoned by that same old freighter's network of contacts 9 days earlier. Gully Boone, given the choice between loyalty to a company that had just been exposed as thoroughly rotten and a chance to save his own neck, was the first to talk, and once Boone talked, Pruitt's careful denials collapsed within the hour. Sig Talmadge, who had spent 2 weeks wrestling with a conscience he had thought long dead, found in that final public reckoning enough courage to hand the marshal his own quiet record of every time Ostrander Freight had ordered him to look away, a small, cowardly redemption, but a real one. It was Josie, in the end, who was given the final word on Vance Pruitt's fate, standing before the marshal with the man who had chained her to a scale and branded her father a thief, now facing genuine consequence for the first time in his careful, calculated life. What she wanted, instead, was for every dollar Ostrander Freight had cheated out of Larkspur Crossing's independent haulers over 3 years to be returned in full under the marshal's supervision, public oversight, where it could never again be twisted into a weapon against the very people who depended on it. It was a harder sentence, in its way, than a bullet would have been. It cost Elias Ostrander his freedom, his fortune, and every last shred of the quiet respectability he had spent 5 years rebuilding, and it left Larkspur Crossing with something no single act of revenge could ever have given it: an honest scale and honest books. Standing at the center of a town that had finally learned to demand both. The territorial marshal's accounting, once it was finally open to the public record, took the better part of a month to complete, and it ran to numbers far larger than anyone in Larkspur Crossing had guessed. The widower Cobble got his grazing land back, deed restored, and refiled at the marshal's own insistence. The young couple who had spent a hard winter paying off a doubled lumber bill got their overpayment returned with interest. 4 independent haulers who had quietly signed complaints in the weeks before Ostrander's arrival split a restitution sum that let 2 of them buy their own wagons outright for the first time in their working lives. It was slow, unglamorous justice, more paperwork than gunfire, and that, the old freighter liked to say afterward, was exactly the kind of justice that actually lasted, the kind that left a town with something to show for it besides a fresh grave. If you'd like to support the channel, tap join and become a member. It truly helps keep the fire lit. The weeks after Ostrander Freight came apart were strange. Quiet ones in Larkspur Crossing, the particular hush that settles over a town once it realizes the danger it had grown used to, living beside, is finally truly gone. Josie used what remained of her father's small estate, and no small portion of the restitution the marshal's court eventually ordered, to buy back the freight contracts Ostrander had strangled out of 6 independent haulers. The beginnings of a small, honest freight line that ran under the name Marlowe and Daughter, a name she chose deliberately, so that anyone reading it on the side of a wagon would know exactly whose memory it honored. She turned the old scale house, once the site of her worst humiliation, into something closer to a way station, a place where stranded travelers' debtors fleeing worse arrangements than her own had been, and tired teamsters passing through, could find a meal and a fair wait. Jonah Reed did not stay. His name had been cleared of the Whitfield bounty in the same proceedings that brought Ostrander down, The marshal's long-buried report finally entered properly into the record. But a wanted man's life does not unravel all its old threads in a single season. Unrelated charge from his years of hard undercover work that no single confession in Larkspur Crossing could touch, a debt of his own, in its way, one he intended to write out and settle honestly before he let himself imagine building anything permanent on ground still this unsettled beneath him. He let Josie know as much the evening before he rode out, sitting on the porch step of the house he had helped defend, and she did not ask him to stay, because she had learned, in the hardest month of her life, that some things cannot be held onto by asking. What passed between them that last evening was not the kind of thing songs are written about. Not yet, not with the bounty still hanging unresolved over one of their heads. But it was something steadier than romance, a quiet understanding built out of firewood split without her having to ask, and shots fired to protect rather than to punish. Two people who had each, in their own way, been chained by somebody else's ledger and had cut each other loose. He made her a quiet promise instead. Safety was not a thing a man could offer from 2 states away, but once his own accounts were finally settled, he'd come back and find out whether Larkspur Crossing still had room for a teamster. The scale house door, she let him know, would be open, however long it took. He rode out at first light, the way he had ridden into a dozen towns before this one, alone, unhurried, a plain coat over old scars, and if the folks of Larkspur Crossing noticed that this particular drifter sat a little straighter in the saddle than most. That something in the way he tipped his hat to Josephine Marlowe on the boardwalk suggested a debt of an entirely different, gentler kind than the ones this story had begun with. None of them let on out loud. They had learned by then that the quietest people in Larkspur Crossing were very often the ones worth watching closest, and they were content, for once, to let 2 people who had earned a little privacy keep it. Old-timers in that part of the territory will still tell you, if you buy them a coffee and let them talk long enough, that the truest law in any freight town was never really written down in a company ledger at all, that a scale can be rigged and a debt can be forged and a badge can be bought, but that, sooner or later, in every town worth the name, somebody quiet steps out of the crowd who has simply decided that enough is enough, and that the whole business of frontier justice, when you strip away the guns and the legends, generally comes down to nothing more complicated than one person refusing to look away. Josephine Marlowe kept that scale house running honest for the rest of her long life, and she never once, in all the years afterward, let a single traveler leave it without a fair wait and a full meal, in memory of a father who never got either from the company that killed him, and in thanks to a wanted man who once looked at a forged number on a ledger page and decided, quietly, that it was time to name it for what it was. That's the tale for tonight, friends. If it kept you company through the dark hours, we'd be grateful for a like, a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, and a subscribe to ride along with us on the next one. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your accounts honest.